it sure is windy and dusty, and my goodness, the sand, it just gets everywhere. Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video. We're doing another Star Frontiers video here, and where are we? We are on my version of Laco, the sandy, strewn desert planet that I had in my campaign. It was an interesting experience, but it was also, while something I really tried to invest a lot of science into and believability, it was ultimately brought down by the most obvious piece of logic from my players. So I just thought I'd give you a little bird's eye view, almost literally in this case, of Laco, my little campaign that I had here. I thought to myself, now Laco is one of the planets, it's mentioned, it orbits the star Dixon star, and it is known because on pages 56 and 57 of Zebulon's Guide to Frontier Space, they talk about the corporate wars, how this was starting to become a thing, especially between Sathar War 1 and Sathar War 2. Anybody who's not deep into the lore of Star Frontiers may not know that, but I thought to myself, I'm going to set my campaign between Sathar War 1 and Sathar War 2. I just thought that would make the most interesting, compelling timeline. And so Laco's war was happening, and I thought, okay, but I don't want it to become its own separate thing. I was kind of fleshing out what my campaign was going to be, and I didn't really know very well. So I just thought, okay, what to me is Laco's war? It obviously takes place on the planet Laco, and there's no details really given about it. I mean, the amount of hours of the day and that kind of stuff. But I thought to myself, I want to do my version of a desert planet. Now, we all know Tatooine and Arrakis and all these other things from other science fiction. And I just thought, okay, I want to do my desert planet, but I want it to be different, and I want it to make sense. And I remember learning in school about erosion, of all things. It suddenly set up a little flag in my head. I was like, you know, one interesting major force of erosion in the world is wind. And I thought, imagine a windy planet. That would have sand blowing around, and it could be kind of interesting. A desert planet, but not the typical, oh, we don't have any water, or, you know, barren, sort of forgotten landscape or anything like that. Why don't I make my desert planet using the idea of erosion? So I thought, okay, what causes wind? Well, the temperature of the water versus the temperature of the land. If there's a big difference, there's a lot of wind going back and forth. I thought, okay, the land on Laco is very changeable. The temperature rises and sets with the sun much faster than it does on Earth, so you got this big disparity of the temperatures, and therefore wind starts kicking around and it blows everything, and eventually erosion caused over thousands or millions of years makes my planet, it's a desert planet with sand dunes and rolling hills and all that kind of stuff, with a few rocky outcrops and things, but it's not the standard, it's not the proverbial stereotypical desert planet. And I thought, oh, look at me being all clever. I'm doing so well with my initial concept of Laco. Now, how did I handle Laco's war? I kind of, very remotely, broadly, I took what was in the book, because again, Zebulon's Guide, I had thought, hey, this is volume 1, there's going to be more volumes. Clearly, I need to set the stage for what Laco's war is. And it does mention how it went on for a long time, and it dealt with a lot of battles. It was between the Pan-Galactic Corporation, which is basically the big Amazon / Microsoft / Apple / Google of the Star Frontiers world, pitted up against rival company Streel, which is again another Amazon, Google, you know, Microsoft, etc. And I thought, now, again, you gotta remember, I'm young, I don't get the idea of two companies fighting for something yet, and especially back in the 80s or 90s when I was doing my campaign. None of that really made any sense to me, so I just thought, okay, what do I draw from for inspiration for this war in my world? And I remember, I don't know if I saw the movie, no, it hadn't come out yet. I started like picking up on the vibe of kind of Mexican cartels and groups that are corrupt and, you know, political dealings and that kind of thing. I just thought to myself, that's something I want to like come from. That's something I want to echo in my game. So I thought to myself, okay, Pangalactic and Striel are vying for territory on Laco. Whoever gets the most territory will then win that seat at the United Planetary Federation Council. So the two of them are struggling and fighting to get the most amount of land on this windswept world. And I thought to myself, yeah, that sort of works. I mean, it doesn't, now that I'm older and looking at it, it was like, no, this didn't make a lot of sense because, I'm not going to go that deep into it. Let's just say I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to make my Laco's War work. But I had, the setting made some interesting sense. I had this windswept world, and again, I'm not going desert like dying of no water. I'm thinking more, remember the opening of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan? Chekhov and his captain go to what they think is just an abandoned planet, SETI Alpha 5, and they get there and it's actually really, there's wind blowing all the time. Spoiler for Star Trek II, Khan and his followers had been surviving on that planet. Turned out it was SETI Alpha 6 or 5. Anyway, they managed to survive on that windswept world, and that's kind of what I'm thinking of with my version of Laco. I want it to be a windswept, swirling planet. The wind is actually its own random encounter, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Anyway, so here I am, coming up with this adventure on this world, and I thought, I want to really breathe some life into Laco. How can I make this an alien world? And I came up with some kind of cool creatures that would exist on there. I had in my mind an idea of like the lone rider going out across the sand dunes on some kind of a beast of burden. And I thought to myself, kind of like when I talked about the Star Wars dewback, along those lines, but I wanted it to be very alien and different. And I came up with, in my head, somebody sitting on some very large, flat, pancake-like creature. And I remember thinking to myself, hey, whenever you see footage of Sidewinder snakes going across the desert, you know, they do that swirly kind of movement with their body, and that's how they travel across. Imagine taking two of those side by side, that kind of movement, that propulsion system, and I thought, well, what's something that would move in that manner? And for whatever reason, I thought of manta rays. I thought, can you imagine a really large manta ray, a little more like lumpy, a little more rounded instead of the flat aquatic creature? Something that's more like it takes its wings and it forces them down, and that's how it moves through the ground, across the sand. And I came up with that as an idea. I called it the Blarger. And it was a slow-moving creature, but it could go for days without rest. And I thought, okay, yeah, maybe the locals in Laco would be traveling across the sand dunes on their Blargers. The locals themselves, I also thought, put a little thought into them. I thought, okay, I want these people, you know, humans, Dralsites, Rusks, etc., I want them to be echoing some different kind of a worldly vibe. And I thought, well, if you're living on a planet that's got all this sand kicking up into your face all the time, you're probably going to use a thing to cover your head. Now, in Arab countries, they have a thing called and I'll just look it up here, the shemag. Shema? Anybody who's in the Arab world, let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it's that head dressing, that kind of filtering out all the sand and the grit from your face as the winds kick up. I thought, right, I'm going to make something like that everybody wears, and I'll call it the filter cloak. It'll be made of very thin material, and the locals tend to wrap it around themselves, definitely cover their faces, so that when the wind kicks up, you can prepare yourself, a little bit like Khan and his travelers, or his followers, when Chekhov sees them outside the door. It's like, ooh, what is this? It's these sort of Bedouin creatures. No, these are the followers of Khan. Similarly, my people who walk around on Laco, they would have these filter cloaks, and they would, you know, survive out there in the blowy wilderness that way. Also, I thought to myself, as time went by, I really put a lot of thought into this. If you're a human or a Yazarian or any hairy race, I thought to myself, you know, you wouldn't even bother having your hair made in any way. You wouldn't have braids, well, maybe braids, but you wouldn't have your hair done in any way because the wind would just blow the heck out of it. So probably most hairy creatures like humans, Usarians, etc. would all have like buzz cuts or very short hair or maybe braids. That was something in the time that we're talking. Braids on people were not very common except for maybe, I don't know, Bo Derek in the film 10. That was about the only time you ever really saw them. So, but anyway, back to Laco and my world. Obviously, with all of this wind kicking around, wind power is how all the locals managed to survive, and they would. There's always at least a little bit of a breeze blowing. I actually came up with a random chart of rolling a couple of die based on what is currently the wind. You could either increase or decrease the amount of wind depending on the die roll. And it could get up to tornado strength. There was always that danger of like, this is extremely powerful wind we're talking about here. And I thought to myself, okay, that's interesting. Now we're like, you know, man versus his environment kind of conflict. This will be very, quite a thing for the players to have to overcome. Luckily, with all that sand and with the filter cloak, you could just, I think a lot of Laconians would just bury themselves down and sort of cover their filter cloak over their head and just ride out whatever storm came their way. Under their blarger, most likely. But then I thought to myself, okay, there's one thing. Are there other creatures? Because we got the blarger, that's a pretty big creature. We're going to have a whole ecosystem. And yeah, I came up with these Cree Akuns, I think, or Achuns, which are crab-like creatures where their entire hemispherical body is a mess of claws. I came up with these inchworm things that were fairly like the dune worm, but imagine like only the size of a dog. I had snake-like creatures. I had these bizarre plants that would be on the ground, but they'd have these big, long, wispy tendrils, and the wind would blow them back and forth. And if you happen to be near one, when these things are getting whipped about, you could take damage from it. There was actually the Whisk Scratch, which was, imagine living tumbleweeds with thorns on them. Now, they're not going to be able to make their way toward you and attack you, but if you get too close, they hit you and you draw blood. You know, I had this really interesting, I thought, ecosystem all created for Laco, the world of the desert land. And I thought, yeah, I'm very happy with this. I'm very proud of what I've done with this as a planet for my players to go out and seek adventure. Now, I made a few missteps with the Pangalactic and Striel forces. Like, I had my idea of, okay, so here is this tough world to live on, and the Pangalactic security guys would be, what, driving around on dune buggies, and are they stopping citizens checking their papers? If the land is so movable and so changeable, what is the local town like? And I actually detailed a typical town would be like, you know, in MASH, the sort of military tent, they could just take the whole thing down and sort of move it if they needed to. So mobile army surgeon hospital. I thought to myself, yeah, like a mobile town. If at any moment, if there's like a big tornado or if something nasty's coming, they would just collapse all the buildings and take shelter and then come back out and rebuild it or move somewhere else. I thought that was kind of neat. It would mean that you had kind of a nomad existence, generally speaking, out in the desert. There would be rocky outcrops, though, and there would be bigger towns and bigger cities there. So the people, the sort of Pangalactic or Striel, whoever's running the town, especially these larger ones, they would probably have at the gate, you know, stop. What's your citizenship and all this kind of stuff. And the locals didn't care. My God, they were probably changing their flag every 2 weeks, so they probably just like, yeah, here's what I am this week. You know, akin to how you hear in some countries, the people don't really care who's winning the war right now. We just want to get our food and stuff like that. So I was kind of going with that vibe. That was really cool. Anyway, into this world come my adventurers, and we're traveling through Laco, and it was a very neat experience. Until my players, one of them specifically, John, pointed out a big flaw in my logic. So, here we are, down on the planet, and you can get, there are space ports in some of the more sort of isolated areas where you can take off and go to the space station. We were in some part of an adventure where they had to go from one town to another town. So we traveled across the dunes and we encountered the big crab creatures, the creatures, and various other things. We would, there would be combat going on. They would occasionally come across, there was a fight going on between some Strio units and some Pangalactic units. Oh wow, this is interesting stuff. This, I guess, pseudo Wild West kind of world going on, kind of, think Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where you've got the Civil War still going on, so sometimes they encounter soldiers of one army, then they encounter soldiers of another army, and sometimes there was a battle taking place. All of that is going on. And then they have to go up to the space station, and I seem to recall it wasn't terribly expensive to travel by space, to get a shuttle up to the space station. I can't remember, but, we're talking like an airplane ticket. And by now my players had a bit of money to them. It's not like Laco was a very destitute world, though I suppose anything that's going through that level of conflict, it would probably lead to the locals not being too rich. I didn't really think that far through it at the time, but we are on the space station, and John is just like, wait a minute, don't we have to go to that town over there? Yeah. Well, instead of going across this nightmare world with all these creatures and all this wind and all this bad stuff, why don't we just get a shuttle from here, go up to the space station, and take another shuttle down? And I was like, darn it, you're right. So, unfortunately, a big part of what I had in my mind was quickly torn asunder from one of my players. So I always felt kind of like, oh man, that was really cool at first, but now that I think more about it, yeah, it doesn't really make that much sense. And similarly, some of the creatures, or not so much the creatures, but like the Laco's war that I had created didn't really make a lot of sense. Two corporations fighting over a planet of nothing but sand. Why are they doing this? I mean, it makes sense in the Dune series because they have the spice, but in my case, it's like, no, it's just a rock. And it was the end of my Laco campaign, or actually, I'll do a little spoiler right now of a far down the road video. The very last session of Star Frontiers that we ever played took place on Laco. It wasn't part of this adventure where John was pointing out the deep fallacy of my logic, but it was another adventure, also on the same world, and it was the last time we played. And I remember thinking to myself then, right, I gotta be a little smarter with how Laco is dealt with. So you're gonna see Laco in another Star Frontiers video someday, but for now, I just thought I would share that little story of what my Laco's War depiction was like, how I tried to invest a bit of science and technology into a desert world. How am I going to do a desert world? And I ended up not doing it very well. So there it is. That is my Star Frontiers video regarding Laco and how it ended up not doing very well. But I mean, maybe if somebody wants to take some of these ideas, I like the idea of the Blarger, that manta ray creature, going across a windswept world sounds great in theory. So I don't know if there's any morsels here that some of the Star Frontiers players feel like they can make use of. Go for it. It's awesome. And I guess until next time, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.